Hello, I hope that the peer review outline activity that you just completed has been really helpful in helping you look at the global elements of your essay. Now, as you turn that outline into a rough draft, you're going to want to think about more local elements. So some of the smaller stuff that can also really lead to some serious essay point deductions, which I don't want to see happen to you. So I'm going to point out some of what I call my final essay reminders, your guide to an A, because if you keep these things in mind and you master them and you do them to the best of your ability, I really think that you will get a strong essay grade on this paper. We're going to begin by clarifying some points on quote integration. Now, last week I vaguely and not nearly as in depth as I wanted to told you about the four main integration methods. They are the he said, she said, the use of that, the blend, and the block. I'm going to give you an opportunity to look more closely at how these integration methods are used and how you need to cite your quotes in your essay. So first, we're going to look at the he said, she said method. I want you to take a moment and just read this quote that I picked from The Power of One as an example. Now, when you're using the he said, she said method, it's important to remember that you don't really need to use the word said. It's really boring, it detracts from your voice, and it makes your paper sound really formulaic, which you want to avoid if at all possible. So instead of saying he said or she said, you might try words like she laments, he cries, she yells, he explains, she replies, he asks, she questions, he denies. There are a lot of words to convey said without using that word. So you want to try, and as your vocabulary expands, throw some of those words in to make your writing more interesting and again to create your own unique voice. In the example below, you'll see that I use the word recalls. So the example reads, when PK is sent to boarding school at a young age, he recalls. Now, when you are using the he said, she said method, you need to put a comma after your word, okay, and before you begin your quote. Then you'll have the open quotations, the quote itself. At the end of the quote, you'll see there's the end quotations followed by the parenthetical citation, which begins with an open parentheses, the author's last name, a space, the page number, close parentheses, and then last but not least, the period. Please also remember that your entire essay should be in Times or Times New Roman font, which this presentation is not in, so your quote will look like this, but not exactly like this, hopefully. The next quote integration method that we're going to look at is the use of that. So again, I ask that you just read this quote that I picked as an example. It's from The Secret Life of Bees this time. Now you'll see that the example again begins with a short little introduction to the quote. If you remember the little sandwich that I taught you about last week, this would be part of the context that you're using to introduce the quote and make the quote make sense to the reader. So we have, while staying with the Boatwright sisters, Lily realizes that, and then the quote begins. Now, this is different from the he said, she said method because we use the word that, and in using the word that, we no longer need a comma. So that just flows right into the quote, which begins with quotation marks. And then at the end of the quote, we see the end quotation marks, followed by parentheses, author's last name, space, page number, end parentheses, and then the period that goes outside of the parenthetical citation. The blend is, in my mind at least, one of the hardest integration methods because not every quote lends itself to a smooth blend. Please take a moment to read the quote that I picked. This time it is from The Power of One. Now, the blend is exactly what its name suggests. It's you blending your context, your own words, into the quote. So what we have is, it becomes apparent that the only reason PK is able to overcome all of his challenges is because he has become an expert at camouflage. So there's no words signaling the beginning of the quote. The quote is just blended into the author's own writing. So we see there's no comma, it's just the writer's words and then the quotations that signal that we're entering a quote. Now, frequently you'll need to change words inside of the quote to fit in with your own writing. In order to do that, we use brackets. So what you see in this quote is, instead of my precocity when PK was the speaker, we now have his precocity, so that we know that we're talking about PK and not the author, not the actual essay writer. We also see the brackets used to change tense. Since we changed the subject of the sentence, we also need to change the tense of our verbs. At the end of the quote, you'll see that just like the other methods that we've looked at, you end the quotation and go into your parenthetical citation. Open parentheses, author's last name, space, page number, end parentheses, and the period that goes outside the parenthetical citation. The block. Now, the block has a set of rules that dictate when you should use the block quote and how you can use the block quote. So the first rule is that there must be more than 4 lines of prose or 3 lines of verse in order for you to even consider using a block quote. So prose would be our short stories, our novels, etc., whereas verse would be lyrics, poems, etc. The block quote should be indented 2 tabs, which is equal to 10 spaces or 1 inch. There are no quotation marks when using a block quote, except if there's dialogue between 2 people within the quote. And a majority of the time, block quotes are introduced with a sentence ending in a colon. This sentence will be the context for the quote, or at least the last piece of the context for the quote, and then we'll signal the beginning of that quote with a colon. Now, here's what that should look like. You'll have your context sentence or statement up here. Lily finally realizes the true conflict T-Ray faces on the inside when he comes close to killing her in a fit of rage, and she admits that. And then we have our colon indicating that the block quote's going to begin. And what you'll see is how this is formatted. So the block quote should look like a block of text. Okay, this left side should be this straight indented line, and this should be 2 tabs or 1 inch. There are no quotation marks when you use a block quote. The blocked format lets us know that you are quoting. Now, the other weird thing about a block quote is the placement of the period. Since there's no quotation marks, it goes at the end of the quote before the parenthetical citation. So we have a period, open parentheses, author's last name, space, page number, close parentheses, and no period outside the parentheses. This is the only time you will end your quote like this. Only in block quotes. Now, quote integration is obviously not the only area where students struggle when writing essays. So I wanted to take a couple more minutes of your time to talk about some of the most common essay errors I see that you want to try your absolute best to avoid. The first one is one that we have spent a lot of time discussing in class, but it's one that is so important that I will constantly and probably always bring it up. Having no thesis or a weak thesis sets your paper off to fail. You want to make sure that you have a strong thesis, as it is the most important sentence in your entire essay. It needs to present your basic argument. It's your tagline or summary of the debate in your essay in one sentence. It sets the reader up to know what he or she will be reading about. For this essay, the conflict resolution essay, you will have 3 pieces to your thesis statement. The first is a statement of the conflict that you are focusing on. Remember that this should be specific. Second, you need to answer the question, is this conflict resolved? No fence straddling. Make sure it's very clear that you either think the conflict is resolved or you don't. And then a look at why or how this conflict is resolved. You might also consider what the character learns from the conflict resolution cycle. That's where you'll find that big argument that's going to really guide the rest of your paper. Now, I expect that all of you will have a conclusion paragraph, since we spent time in class talking about what you should include in a conclusion paragraph. However, just because you write one doesn't mean it's strong. One of the biggest issues I see that really weakens a conclusion is when a writer adds new information into the conclusion paragraph. You don't want to do that. Your conclusion should almost mirror your introduction, in that you begin with your thesis statement restated, review the main points of your essay, and then find some final commentary that really drives your point home. There's no time in that conclusion paragraph for you to introduce new evidence or new points. That leaves the reader hanging, which is never a good idea. One of the biggest weaknesses to any argument is when the person has no evidence. For this paper, you should have evidence, as you are expected to use quotes. However, if you don't use your evidence effectively, then it's like you have no evidence. So make sure that you are doing more than just placing quotes into your writing because I said you have to. Make sure that those quotes are tightly aligned with your argument and that you're explaining how and why they prove your point. If you leave a quote to just act for itself, it won't be effective and it will weaken your essay. Commas are another common error that I see in essays. Frequently, students overuse commas rather than underuse them. Now, I know that we haven't had any lessons on when to use commas, so I'm going to kind of ask you to go off of what you already know. If you're completely clueless on commas, don't worry, we will spend time learning about them, and I just want you to do your best. This is your first essay, and in many ways, it's a writing sample for me. So don't feel like you have to know everything about writing in this very first essay. As far as commas are concerned, though, things that I want you to pay attention to is that the most frequent use of commas is when you have a series of nouns that you're separating, or when you're trying to separate clauses in a sentence. Aside from that, there are obviously more technical uses of commas, but many of you won't be using commas in that way in this essay. Spelling errors and typos might seem self-explanatory. Unfortunately, people frequently leave spelling mistakes in their essays. Sometimes these are just typos and not necessarily that the person doesn't know how to spell those words, but it does lead to you losing some easy points. My recommendation is to not rely on your computer's self-check feature or spell check feature, especially not your iPad's spell check feature, as it often overlooks words like character names, which you definitely don't want to misspell. Please do your best to do a read-through of your essay just for spelling. If you are really worried about spelling, I would also recommend that you try and get a friend or a parent or another teacher, a tutor, whatever, to look at your paper for spelling and or grammar issues, as sometimes our spelling and grammar mistakes mask themselves where we see them as correct because we've been spending way too much time staring at our essay. This ties back to what I was just talking about in terms of commas, but punctuation problems are also another common error I see. You want to make sure that all of your sentences are punctuated as correctly as possible. This includes the use of semicolons, colons, period, exclamation marks, and question marks. You want to try your best to use these appropriately and in the right place. Again, I am relying on you to use your previous knowledge of grammar to do your best to present the most grammatically correct paper you can. I briefly mentioned the importance of transitions when we talked about body paragraphs, but I just want to remind you that transitions are important within your paragraphs and between your paragraphs. You want to make sure that you're linking your ideas so that your writing flows, but also so that your logic flows. I need to know the way ideas connect or how you expect me to connect them in order to fully understand what you're trying to prove to me. So please try and go through your essay looking at the beginning of each paragraph, the transition between ideas, and make sure that you are using your transition words to link your ideas together and create relationships within your essay that I can understand. And last but not least, I want to talk to you about repetition. Now, repetition plays a role in your essay. A lot of you were seeing that the essay structure essentially calls for reinforcement, but reinforcement is not repetition. You want to make sure that you are not discussing the same idea in every paragraph. Instead, you should be focusing in on pieces of the same argument in each paragraph. We talked about the organization for this essay being one paragraph that focuses on the conflict and one paragraph that focuses on the resolution. The second issue that I frequently see with repetition is the repetition of words, whether that's character names being constantly repeated or that you use a specific word over and over and over again. Please also make sure that you are proofreading for that. It's helpful to read your essay out loud before you turn it in because sometimes when you don't see repetition, you hear it. This is also helpful for issues like flow, grammar, spelling, etc. Now, my final words of advice to you are to make sure that you don't forget some of the things that we've talked about these last couple weeks. The first that I want to draw your attention to is use of the literary present. It's really easy to forget this and go into the past tense. Please try and avoid that. The second is use of the first and second person. I've seen this in thesis statements already, so I just want to make sure that you are double or triple checking that you're avoiding this, with the one exception that the first person can be used in the hook and the final commentary. You should still be avoiding at all costs the use of second person though. You want to make sure also that you are double checking all MLA. I recommend that you use your rubric as a checklist when you're finalizing your final drafts or even your rough drafts so that you're getting practice setting up MLA. Next, I want to talk to you briefly about word choice. Now, word choice is something that writers worry about and fight with their entire writing careers. One kind of phrase that you can use to guide you is that it's not about using big words, it's not about using small words, it's about using the right words. You need to use the words that you are comfortable with using. If your vocabulary isn't as amazing as you want it to be yet, that's okay. You can improve that and work on that. But forcing in words that you don't fully understand because you think they make you sound smarter doesn't typically help you, because what I see a lot is students misuse words. And I don't want to see you doing that because you're trying to make your paper sound a certain way. Use the vocabulary that you are comfortable with. This really helps you gain authority because your voice is more confident when you are yourself. It also makes your papers more interesting to me when it seems like you would actually write that. So please, again, create your own voice by picking words that you are comfortable with using. Now, the last point I have listed here is a difficult one, and it takes nuance to really understand. Plot summary is not analysis. It is often necessary for you to recount some of the plot to make your point, but your paper cannot be solely a plot summary. Now, for many of you, I've talked to you about this because your thesis statement's read as a plot summary, and your thesis statement is what sets up your analysis. So again, that goes back to why our thesis statements are so important to our papers. But I want you to remember that I've read these books, so I know what happens in the book. You still need to ground me in where you're headed and give me context and remind me of things that happened. But I need you to do more than that. I need you to recount the relevant part of the plot and only the relevant part of the plot, and then make analytical statements about the passages that you are using. So show me that you have original thoughts about what happens in this book. Typically, when I see students veering more towards summary than analysis, it's because they aren't asking or answering those how and why questions. You need to find an argument, and you need to make sure that you're analyzing your quotes to prove that argument. That's the point of an essay, and if you aren't doing that, or you aren't doing that well, you start losing a lot of points off your body paragraphs. If this is confusing to you at all, please come and see me, and we can talk about it in more depth and make sure that you're properly analyzing your quotes. I will be checking in on outlines if I haven't already checked in on yours to make sure that analysis is heading in the right direction. Well, that's all I have for you for right now. I hope this was helpful and that it helps you plan ahead on crafting drafts that don't make these errors. If you have any questions about any of the material that I've covered in this video, please shoot me an email and I will try my best to get back to you before I get back from Kairos. Until then, I hope that you have happy rough draft writing, and I look forward to reading these essays, which will be due day 1 of next week.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.